They tried to charge my grandfather $700,000 to promote a hotel he had no idea even existed. A hotel he'd never stayed in, never consented to, and here's the wild part. It was secretly constructed on our land. I'm talking full-scale resort, marina, and spa, generating millions, all built right on the property that's been in our family for generations. And not a single one of us had a clue, not even him. What began as a strange invoice spiraled into the biggest legal battle we'd ever faced. Ever had something taken from you without you even realizing it? I'd love to hear your story in the comments. I never imagined a phone call could turn my entire world upside down. But on that Tuesday morning in March, when my grandfather called, his voice was trembling in a way I'd never heard before. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. "Owen," he said, trying to steady his breath over the line. "They're asking for $700,000. My first instinct, oddly enough, was to laugh. Maybe it was the shock, or maybe I assumed he misunderstood something. But as he kept talking, as he started reading the formal-looking document that had shown up in his mailbox that morning, I realized this wasn't just some scam. It was a calculated move against my family. Let me rewind a bit to give you some context. My grandfather had owned a lovely little piece of lakefront land for over 50 years. Something passed down to him by my great-grandfather back in the 70s. I grew up spending every summer there, fishing off the dock, swimming in the pristine water, roasting marshmallows by the fire, while Grandpa shared stories from his youth. That place was our family's haven, a quiet, treasured corner of what eventually became Crystal Cove, a now upscale resort area. At least, I thought we just owned the lake and maybe a small stretch around it. Grandpa was always vague about the boundaries, saying things like, "Your great-grandfather left us this lake. You can always fish here." Looking back, I probably should have asked more questions. But everything seemed so simple, why doubt it? Then came the HOA notice that flipped everything upside down. Grandpa read it to me line by line, his frustration growing with each sentence. The total? $700,000 in backdated lake management fees. I had to ask him to say the number again, it sounded completely ridiculous. Then he listed the charges: $200,000 for landscaping, $150,000 for tourism safety, and the part that really set me off, $350,000 for hotel marketing. Not operations, not upkeep, marketing. They billed him like he owned and operated the resort. Who in their right mind thought they could send a letter demanding that kind of money and expect him to pay it? Attached to the demand was something even more infuriating. A signed agreement from 2019 that looked like Grandpa's signature, supposedly approving payments for shared tourism expenses. When I asked him about it, he looked genuinely shaken. "Son," he said, "I swear on your grandmother's grave I don't remember signing anything like that. Maybe they had me sign something during all that construction, but it wasn't about paying for anything. I'd never agree to hotel advertising fees. That doesn't even make sense." And I believed him. Even at 82, my grandfather was sharp as ever. He wasn't someone who'd forget signing away hundreds of thousands of dollars. It reeked of fraud, and I was furious just thinking about how they were exploiting him. What made it worse was how they treated the lake as if it belonged to everyone, as if it was just another resort asset when it clearly was part of our inheritance. "They keep calling it the resort's main attraction," Grandpa said, confused. "I don't get it. It's just our little lake." That line stuck with me. Just our little lake. At first, I thought they were simply being greedy, trying to milk a small family property for some extra cash because it happened to look nice. It felt like they spotted a quiet old man by the water and assumed he'd be an easy target. Over time, they'd been turning the screws, citing tall trees, unregulated fishing, even threatening to cut off his utilities, all tactics meant to force him out. I did my best to reassure him, though I was probably more fired up than comforting. "Don't worry, Grandpa," I said. "I'll head down there this weekend and let them know exactly where they can shove that fake invoice. They can't bully retirees into funding their resort. That's not how property rights work." He seemed relieved that I was stepping in, but I could still hear the worrying in his voice. These people saw a kind, solitary man by the lake and decided he was ripe for the picking. It was like watching vultures circle, except these vultures wore business suits and carried legal stationery. The longer we talked, the more convinced I became that this was your classic HOA tower trip. A group of entitled residents who figured they could drain money from anyone too scared or confused to fight back. I'd heard stories about HOA horror shows, But this was next level. $700,000 for lake maintenance. It was beyond absurd almost. Comedic, if it weren't so serious. But I wasn't laughing anymore. They'd picked the wrong family to mess with. I promised Grandpa I'd be there Saturday morning and we'd get to the bottom of it together. What I didn't know then was that trying to protect what I thought was a simple, family-owned lake would lead me to uncover something far bigger than I ever imagined. As I drove in, I barely recognized Crystal Cove. The whole area had transformed, gleaming hotels, fancy marinas, spas. It was like someone had poured a fortune over our lake. The night before, I'd called our old neighbor Frank to ask what had been going on while I'd been busy with work in the city. What he told me only added fuel to the fire. "Owen," he said, "they're obsessed with that lake of yours. Every HOA meeting, it's all about the lake. They keep calling it the heart of the resort." I figured they were just hyping it up to justify their inflated fees, making our little family lake sound like it was something more than it really was. But when I got there, the reality hit me hard. The quiet lakeside spot I remembered had become a luxury resort compound. There was a five-star hotel that looked straight out of an architecture magazine, a sleek marina lined with boats worth more than my apartment, a floating restaurant on the water, and a spa where rich folks in robes wandered around sipping smooths. Strangely, my first reaction wasn't suspicion, it was pure rage. These people were raking in millions from tourists and yacht owners, and still squeezing an old man for fees. It was cruelty disguised as business. I pulled up to the HOA office, a gleaming building more lavish than most people's homes, and tried to calm myself before stepping inside. I knew blowing up wouldn't help Grandpa. Still, I was already imagining how good it would feel to tell these crooks exactly what I thought of their fake invoice. The receptionist, a nervous woman named Rachel, seemed almost apologetic when I told her why I was there. "You're here about Mr. Williams?" she asked. I nodded, and her face softened. "Miss Carter will see you shortly. She's been paying close attention to this case." The way she said it made me think Rachel might not agree with how her boss was handling things. I didn't have a moment to dwell on it, though, because the office door swung open and out walked Evelyn Carter herself. She carried herself like she didn't just run the office, but owned the entire lake. No greeting, no handshake. "You must be old man Williams's grandson," she said, skipping over any basic courtesy like hello or nice to meet you. Her tone was curt, almost like I was a nuisance she'd been forced to address. "Finally, someone from your family is taking this seriously," she added. That word seriously made my teeth clench. Seriously about what, exactly? Paying for her hotel's flashy marketing campaign. "I'm here about that outrageous invoice you sent to my grandfather," I said, doing my best to keep my voice calm and professional. "That's his lake. He doesn't owe your people a cent." Evelyn let out a laugh, cold, condescending, the kind of sound that made me want to turn around and walk out. "Young man," she said, "the way you talk to a child, that lake you're so protective of is the cornerstone of our brand. It brings in millions every quarter. Your family needs to start contributing, just like every other property owner around here." To me, it still sounded like a slick way to dress up stealing, but what really got under my skin was that she actually believed every word of it. That was worse than if she'd just been bluffing. "You can't charge my grandfather for land he already owns," I told her, voice rising despite my efforts to keep it together. "This is extortion, pure and simple." Her expression shifted, just slightly. For the first time, she seemed to actually see me as someone who might be worth taking seriously. "Oh, do you have a lawyer, Mr. Hale?" she asked. "Because I highly recommend you find one. Land disputes can get very messy, especially when families have ignored zoning changes and local development laws for decades." The phrase "land disputes" caught me off guard. I thought this whole thing was just about bogus fees. But I was too wound up to really process it at the time. Looking back, that throwaway line was probably the first real clue that I was missing something big. That meeting ended like two people drawing battle lines, though neither of us really knew what the war was even about yet. Evelyn handed me a card, her lawyer's info, and told me I'd be wise to get serious before things escalated. I told her the only thing that needed resolving was her dropping the false charges against my grandfather. As I walked out, I felt a flicker of pride. I'd stood my ground, defended our land, and made it clear we wouldn't be intimidated. Rachel gave me a quiet, sympathetic look as I left, And I remember thinking at least someone in that building still had a conscience. But as I drove home, Evelyn's words echoed in my head. Land disputes. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, a bigger piece of the puzzle. I mean, why was she so confident if she was just trying to scam us? And why did everyone treat our lake like it was part of their luxury resort? I kept telling myself I was overthinking it. Sometimes people bluff with confidence, even when they're completely wrong. But something didn't sit right. I was starting to suspect there was a lot more going on than I realized. And that phrase land dispute lodged in my mind like a splinter I couldn't ignore. The harassment picked up fast after that meeting. It was clear I'd struck a nerve by standing up to her. Within days, Grandpa was dealing with a new level of retaliation that felt calculated and unnecessarily cruel. First, they shut off his electricity, claiming some obscure billing violation which felt made up on the spot. Then came a $500 fine because his oak trees were blocking the lake view of the resort. Trees that had been there longer than the resort had even existed. The final blow came when they posted official-looking signs, banning fishing on the lake, declaring it unauthorized activity on tourism property. I had to see it with my own eyes, drove down there just to look at the signs. I was stunned. They were treating my grandfather's lake like it belonged to them, like he was the intruder. I'd never felt so furious and helpless at once. This man, gentle, quiet, kind, was suddenly being treated like a criminal just for living on the land he'd always called home. The stress was starting to show. When I called to check in, his voice sounded worn down, defeated. It broke my heart. "Owen," he said during one tough call, "maybe we should just pay them something to make it stop. I'm too old for this fight. I just want to fish in peace." That's when I realized this was never about a few fees. This was about ownership. And if I was right, we weren't just defending what was ours, we might be trying to reclaim it. So I did what I should have done from the start. I went to the county land registry office to figure out what we actually owned. Up until then, I'd been working off assumptions, just knowing Grandpa owned the lake and a little land around it. But I'd never seen a deed. Never looked at any actual surveys. I took a day off work and drove to the registry office, determined to get answers. The clerk, an older guy, seemed friendly enough. "What exactly are you trying to find?" he asked. "I need to verify that my family owns the lake at Crystal Cove," I told him. "Just the lake?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I didn't understand the question. Of course, just the lake. That's what we'd always believed. But thinking back, maybe he was trying to steer me toward a bigger discovery. In one of those dusty cabinets, I found what changed everything. An old property survey dated 1985. It was hand-drawn, a little faded, but the boundary lines were still clear. I laid it out on the table and traced the borders with my finger, expecting to see a small area around the lake, an acre or two, maybe. But the lines kept going and going. The property outlined was much, much bigger than I'd ever imagined. This wasn't a modest lakeside lot. It was a huge stretch of land spilling far beyond the lake itself. At first, I assumed it had to be a mistake. Maybe the surveyor got it wrong. But the more I studied it, the more convinced I became that it was legit. Who would fake a survey from the mid-80s? Then came the realization that really hit me. Parts of the resort, the marina, maybe even some of the hotel might be sitting on our land. I felt this strange rush, part disbelief, part excitement, like finding cash in an old coat pocket and not knowing if it's real. What I'd always thought of as Grandpa's dock might actually be the front porch of a multi-million-dollar resort built on our property. I snapped photos of everything, my hands trembling. This wasn't just about a fee anymore. This could be something massive. As I drove home, Evelyn's words came flooding back. Land dispute. What if this was never about fees? What if she knew how far our property extended and had been trying to make us acknowledge her right to use our land? That would explain her determination, her confidence. She wasn't trying to scam us, she was trying to create a precedent, a paper trail, something that said we accepted the resort's claim. The thought made me nauseous. Had we been sitting on valuable land this whole time, while someone else got rich from it? But it also gave me hope, because if I was right, we weren't victims, we were rightful owners. Maybe we had the leverage to fight back. I realized I needed expert advice. Property law, title rights. This wasn't just an HOA complaint anymore. The clerk's question and that old map hinted at something far bigger, I needed someone to tell me whether I was crazy for thinking we might own half of Crystal Cove Resort, or if I'd just uncovered something that could change everything. I kept going over that old map, tracing the lines again and again, one question echoing through my mind. Do we only own the lake? Or have we been missing something enormous all these years? I couldn't let it go. So I went back, decided to confront Evelyn directly with what I'd found. Maybe it was reckless to show my hand so soon, but I had to see her reaction. I didn't know what I hoped would happen. Maybe she'd back down. Maybe she'd explain it away. Or maybe I just wanted to knock her off balance the way she'd done to my grandfather. When I walked into the HOA office that Tuesday, Rachel gave me a look, a silent warning. Like she knew I was poking a hornet's nest. I asked to see Evelyn, and while I waited, I laid the old survey out on the front counter and stared at those boundary lines again. The more I looked, the more certain I became. This wasn't a fluke. This was the actual, legal description of our land, and it was big. When Evelyn appeared, she looked irritated to see me again until she caught sight of the paper. Then something shifted, her eyes locked onto the map, and for the briefest moment, she hesitated. Like a predator sizing up a threat. I'd like an explanation, I said, keeping my tone steady even though my pulse was pounding. This is a 1985 survey of my family's property. Can you tell me why these boundaries are so different from what you claim we own? She took the map and examined it for what felt like forever. I watched her face closely. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed. She wasn't dismissive anymore, she was calculating, trying to gauge how much I knew, and how much I was just guessing. She called the map outdated, but her voice lacked confidence. It wasn't dismissive, it was defensive. But if this is accurate, I said, then we own a lot more than just the lake, don't we? That's when she called for her lawyer, a jittery man named Davies who looked like he'd been dragged in from something urgent. When she handed him the survey, he looked even more unsettled than she did. Well, he said, nervously adjusting his glasses, clearly trying to buy time. An outdated survey map can't just erase the facts of lawful construction and development that's taken place over the years. The resort poured millions into building projects that followed the proper legal channels and got all the necessary permits. The way he stressed legal construction caught my attention. It felt off. Why put so much emphasis on that word unless there was doubt surrounding it? Legal construction, where, exactly? I asked. Davies stumbled through his papers. When I pressed, on land acquired through legitimate means, naturally from the legal owners at the time, he answered. But when I pushed further and asked who exactly they bought the land from, he grew even more cagey. Well, from the individuals who were listed in the official records during the development phase, he mumbled. He was going in circles, and I could tell he knew more than he was letting on. The whole interaction felt like I'd stepped into a game where everyone knew the rules except me, and they were doing their best to keep it that way. I didn't argue. I let the silence stretch. I let them feel the weight of that document in Evelyn's hands. I wanted them to think about what might happen if this information got out, if someone from the county, or worse, the media, started asking hard questions. That's when Davies gave me a look like he was trying to figure out just how much I really knew. I held my gaze. I wanted them uncertain, unsettled. If a simple survey rattled them this much, I could only imagine their reaction when I showed them what else I had. Not long after that meeting, the harassment toward Grandpa escalated sharply, proof I was definitely onto something, even if I didn't yet know what it was. They slapped him with a $1,000 fine for a ridiculous parking violation. His truck hadn't moved from that spot into decades, but suddenly it was an issue. Then, they cut off his water, citing a supposed violation of a community rule, one I'm almost certain they invented just to target him. The final blow came in the form of an official letter from their attorney, threatening to sue us for disrupting community harmony and interfering with resort operations. I mean, really. My grandfather was a threat to community harmony just by living peacefully on his own land. It was so outrageous that, in a twisted way, I almost respected their boldness. If I hadn't been so utterly furious, I started calling lawyers, hoping someone would help, but I hit the same wall over and over. No one wanted to take on an HOA dispute, especially not against a powerful, well-funded resort. These cases are messy and pricey, one attorney told me. Legal fees can quickly surpass any possible payout, and HOAs tend to have deeper pockets than private landowners. Another was even more direct. Unless you've got rock-solid evidence of major wrongdoing, I'd advise you to just pay what they're asking and move on. Fighting an HOA is like wrestling a pig. You both end up dirty, but the pig likes it. I understood their hesitancy, but it still infuriated me. It felt like the whole legal system was tilted to protect people like Evelyn, so long as they had enough money and paperwork with official-looking seals. But the more I studied that old survey, and the harder they pushed back against us, the more convinced I became that something far bigger was happening. I started driving around the resort regularly, comparing the layout I saw with the property lines on the 1985 survey. And slowly, I began to suspect that a huge chunk of their development might actually be built on our land. It seemed too unbelievable to accept, like something out of a courtroom thriller. But the possibility felt real enough that I knew I had to get expert help, someone who truly understood land law and boundary disputes. A friend pointed me toward Samuel Peterson, a retired lawyer who'd worked in property development in Crystal Cove during the 70s and 80s. When I phoned and explained a bit of the situation, he agreed to meet, but there was something in his tone, curious, almost like he already had an inkling about what was going on. We met at a diner halfway between Crystal Cove and the city. I brought everything with me: the old survey, HOA letters, copies of every notice they'd sent Grandpa. Peterson looked to be in his 70s. Calm, precise, the kind of man who'd spent a lifetime parsing complex documents. "I've heard you're having a bit of trouble with the HOA over some lake fees," he said as we settled into a booth with coffee. I began laying out the story, assuming he'd sympathize with a family being bullied over a small patch of land. But when I mentioned our property's location and what we believed we owned, his expression shifted. He grew silent, studying me closely as if weighing whether to share something big or just send me off with legal boilerplate. Then he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick binder. "I worked on Phase 1 permitting for this valley back in '83, he said. "I've seen every boundary line drawn in both ink and asphalt." He flipped through a series of documents: maps, handwritten legal descriptions, letters from the original property owners. "The resort started off legal," he said, "but at some point, greed got involved." He pointed to a hand-drawn plat. "They crossed into your grandfather's land and never corrected it." His voice lowered. "I'm afraid you've misunderstood your situation from the very start." The chill that ran through me when he said that was like ice water. I could tell whatever he was about to reveal would rewrite everything I thought I knew. Peterson slid a folder across the table. Inside was a 1978 survey, much more detailed than the one I'd found in the public registry. "Owen," he said, "your family doesn't just own the lake, you own its backbone, 15 acres. Land that the resort has swallowed whole. Half the hotel sits on your grandfather's dirt." I stared at the map, trying to comprehend what he was saying. My chest tightened. My thoughts collided: legal, emotional, financial, crashing into one another. "I mean exactly that," Peterson said gently, but firmly. "Roughly 60% of the resort's main hotel structure, the entire marina, the spa, that floating restaurant, all of it is standing on property legally owned by your family." It was like he'd just told me the sky was green. I couldn't wrap my head around it. "But that can't be," I stammered. "Surely they purchased the land from us or whoever had it before." Peterson gave me a knowing look, like he'd heard that question before. "That's the issue, Owen. Either someone made a serious mistake when the project was approved, or they knowingly built on land they didn't own. No one noticed, or worse, someone looked the other way." The deeper he went, the more unreal it all felt. He showed me aerial images over the decades. In the 70s, it was just our family's land, the lake, the woods, and touch space. By the early 2000s, a modest resort appeared seemingly on a neighboring plot, which would have been fine, but over the last 15 years, the development exploded, and much of that growth, according to Peterson, happened on our land. "This isn't about if they built on your property," he said. "It's about whether they knew." I stared at the documents and photos, trying to absorb it all. I had painted Evelyn as a greedy HOA president shaking us down over lake fees. But if Peterson was right, the truth flipped the whole story on its head. They weren't charging us for using the lake; they were profiting from running a resort on land that belonged to us. "So," I said slowly, "when they demanded $700,000 in fees, they were basically billing us for maintaining property they're using without permission." Peterson nodded, his expression dark. "Exactly. Another way to look at it, they mail your family over a decade of back rent, plus a share of the profits they've made using your land. The numbers he mentioned were staggering. Peterson estimated the resort earned at least $10 million a year. If 60% of that operation was on our property, we might be owed a massive settlement. This isn't a lake fee squabble, he said. This is one of the most serious cases of property encroachment I've seen. If you can prove it in court, your family may own a large chunk of this resort. I felt lightheaded. Just 6 months ago, I thought we had a simple lakeside property. Now, I was being told we might hold claim to part of a multi-million-dollar empire. It was like discovering a gold mine had been dug right under your feet by someone else. Before we left, Peterson cautioned me, proving this wouldn't be easy. Even with all the evidence, the resort would fight back hard. They'll hire the best attorneys money can buy, he said. They'll dispute everything, every map, every signature, every inch of land. It won't be quick, and it won't be cheap. Still, he seemed confident. Land ownership is pretty black and white in court, he explained. And based on what I've seen, you've got a very strong case. Driving home that day, all I could think about was Evelyn's smugness when she demanded that $700,000. She thought she was shaking down an old man for lake access. She had no idea she might have been handing him half her kingdom. Finding the right lawyer took time. But eventually, I connected with Sarah Mitchell, a specialist in high-stakes land disputes. When I brought in boxes of documents and maps, she spent hours combing through every detail. Her focus was razor-sharp. She got it. "Owen," she said, looking up from the 1978 survey Peterson gave me, "this isn't just a boundary issue. This is full-blown commercial encroachment. If the boundary lines held up in court, and she was confident they would, it wasn't just a matter of compensation. We could potentially own parts of the resort itself." She ran the numbers, based on their annual earnings and how much of the resort was built on our land. She estimated Crystal Cove Resort had earned somewhere between $6 and $8 million each year on land they didn't legally own. If we prove they've been operating without permission for 15 years, she said, you could claim tens of millions in back rent. Maybe even partial ownership of the hotel. I kept asking her to double-check the math. It seemed too wild to be true. But she was certain. What started as a fight over $700,000 might end with our family laying legal claim to a luxury resort worth tens of millions. Sarah was sure we had a solid legal footing, but she wasn't naive about the scale of the fight ahead. Once they grasp what's really going on, once it hits them that their entire business model may rest on land they don't actually own, they'll come at us full force. She cautioned me, this isn't just a courtroom battle. You'll be facing public scrutiny, media stories, and maybe even neighbors turning against you. But if we succeed, we're not just walking away with a check, we're shaking the very foundation they've built on. She reminded me we were going up against a resort operation likely supporting hundreds of jobs and pouring millions into local taxes. They'd be backed by political influence, community loyalty, and a legal budget with no ceiling. Yet, beneath her pragmatism, I could sense her genuine enthusiasm, like she knew this was the kind of high-stakes case lawyers dream of. She told me, property rights are the cornerstone of our legal system. If someone erects a hotel on land they don't own, it doesn't matter how much money they've sunk into it or how many people depend on it. The law is pretty clear. When Evelyn and the HOA received our lawsuit, their response was swift and intense. Just hours after the paperwork was delivered, Grandpa's phone lit up with calls, people pretending to be concerned citizens, HOA members, even local officials, all gently advising him to rethink his decision before things spiraled out of control. Then Evelyn rang me personally. She tried to sound composed, but I could hear the fear creeping through her voice. "Owen, I think there's been a huge misunderstanding about what you're accusing us of," she said. "Maybe we could meet and talk through a fair settlement just to cover the original lake management fees." I told her point blank we weren't talking about lake fees anymore. We were focused now on who actually held title to the land beneath her resort. The pause on the other end was so long, I thought she might have hung up. From there, things escalated quickly. A supposed county assessor began trailing Grandpa around, claiming to be conducting standard land evaluations. The HOA called emergency meetings with city officials, framing our case as a reckless legal stunt threatening the area's financial health. One night, I even received an anonymous phone call. The voice warned me I didn't understand what I was getting into and advised I back off before someone gets hurt. I reported it to the police, but without a clear threat, there wasn't much they could do. Sarah, though, said this kind of intimidation was actually a good sign. It means they're nervous, she told me, and people don't panic unless they believe they could lose, but nothing revealed how seriously they were taking us until Sarah got a call from their legal team offering to settle. They're willing to pay $5 million to make this disappear, she told me, eyes wide. $5 million, Owen. Do you understand what that means? Nobody offers that kind of money to make a weak case go away. They know they're in deep. I imagined the look on Grandpa's face if he saw that check. I could practically hear him say, "That's more than we ever made, son." But I also grasped what Sarah was saying. If they were willing to buy silence for $5 million, the actual damages could be 10 times that. And yes, the offer was tempting. That kind of money would erase every financial worry we'd ever had. Grandpa could live in comfort, I could wipe out my mortgage, maybe take a break from work, and we'd avoid what was sure to be a grueling legal war. But the moment I mentioned that to Sarah, she shut it down. Double quotes, Owen, if they're offering you 5, it's because they know you could win far more in court. Don't let them get off cheap. Not when the truth is on your side. As trial approached, I kept thinking how drastically my view of the whole situation had shifted. Just 6 months earlier, I thought we were dealing with some overzealous HOA complained about a family lake. Now, I realized we'd been sitting on 15 acres of prime waterfront land, while others built a luxury resort on top of it and pocketed every dime. That $700,000 invoice they sent Grandpa, it wasn't just outrageous, it was adding insult to injury. They were billing us for the upkeep of buildings they'd illegally constructed on our land. I felt anger for all the years of stolen income, but also a strange kind of excitement. We had finally uncovered the truth, and we were about to fight for what was rightfully ours. The trial would begin the next day, the moment everything would hinge on. Would the court side with those who had power and money, or would a dusty old survey and one determined grandson be enough to tip the balance? The morning of the hearing, the courthouse was packed. Reporters, local officials, and what looked like half of Crystal Cove had shown up. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore, it had become a full-blown local controversy, a battle over land rights, resort profits, and whether a family could actually end up owning part of a hotel built without their knowledge. Sarah had warned me that public interest would be high, but the sea of cameras and journalists still made the whole thing feel unreal. Across the courtroom, I saw Evelyn, flanked by an army of attorneys. For a moment, I felt the weight of how much they had riding on the sand, how badly they wanted to crush us. The judge called for order, and Sarah rose to present our case with the kind of quiet strength that reminded me exactly why we'd hired her. "Your Honor," she began, "this case is about one central question. Can someone build a commercial enterprise on land they don't legally own?" She laid out the evidence, showing that the defendants had built a multi-million-dollar resort on land held by the Williams family for over 5 decades and had done so without informing or obtaining permission from the rightful owners. She projected the original 1978 survey onto a large screen, followed by up-to-date aerial photos of the resort. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The hotel, marina, and spa sat squarely atop what the survey clearly marked as our property. The opposing attorneys tried to argue that the old survey was outdated, that years of development and municipal approvals should override ancient boundaries. "Your Honor," their lead counsel said, "Crystal Cove Resort has poured more than $50 million into legal, city-approved projects built to current zoning standards. The plaintiffs are essentially asking the court to overturn 15 years of lawful business activity based on obsolete documentation." It sounded persuasive until Sarah stood to cross-examine and asked the one question that stripped their argument bare. "Can you produce any documentation proving your clients purchased this land from the Williams family?" The silence in the courtroom said everything, but the final blow came when their own HOA lawyer took the stand. Under oath, he admitted they had never actually confirmed the land ownership before building. They had simply relied on flood zoning maps. "We followed the correct permit processes," he insisted. But when Sarah pressed him about whether those procedures included confirming legal ownership, he got visibly rattled. The land was zoned for resort use in city planning records. "We assumed that meant it was available." Sarah's response was razor sharp. Does zoning for development mean the same as owning the land? His hesitant no echoed throughout the courtroom. Then came the most damning moment. Rachel, the HOA's receptionist, who'd always seemed sympathetic, testified. She brought forward emails and internal notes showing that Evelyn and the board had discovered the boundary problem years ago and decided to keep it hidden. One message from Evelyn stood out. This boundary issue could seriously jeopardize our business. Under no circumstances can the Williams family find out how much land they actually own. Keep them focused on the lake. Discourage any broader investigation by any means necessary. When Sarah read it aloud, Evelyn turned pale. She had known all along and had actively worked to cover it up. The judge returned less than an hour after deliberations. His face said it all. This court finds that Crystal Cove Resort has been operating knowingly or not on land it does not own. That ends today. He ordered that 60% of the resort, including the main hotel, marina, and spa, be transferred into joint ownership with the Williams family. On top of that, the resort was to pay us $50 million in back rent, return the $700,000 they had charged Grandpa, and cover our full legal fees. But that wasn't all. He also ruled that Evelyn Carter would face criminal charges for fraud, citing her deliberate efforts to conceal property boundaries while demanding payments from us. This behavior crosses the line from civil misconduct into criminal deception, the judge said. When the cuffs snapped around Evelyn's wrists, the courtroom didn't cheer its side in relief. Justice hadn't come with fireworks, it came with paperwork and accountability. 6 months earlier, Evelyn was the smug HOA president demanding $700,000 from Grandpa for land we owned. Now, she was headed to prison for trying to steal it. The months after the trial were almost surreal. One day I was just a city office worker worried about my grandfather's bills, and the next, I was co-owner of a high-end resort. We renamed it Williams Lake Resort and kept the existing team in place to maintain smooth operations while we sorted out long-term plans. Grandpa spent his remaining years in comfort, proud of the land he'd held onto for decades, land that turned out to be worth far more than any of us imagined. Frank, our neighbor who'd stood by us throughout, was elected as the new HOA president, and Rachel was promoted to hotel manager under our leadership. Evelyn was sentenced to 3 years in prison, plus heavy fines for fraud and conspiracy. Back at the lake, the no fishing signs had disappeared. The dock felt different, heavier somehow, like the past had finally settled into place. Grandpa didn't say much that evening, but sitting beside him, I could feel it. That quiet pride. It's wild to think all this started with a ridiculous invoice and ended with us reclaiming a resort we didn't even know was ours. Evelyn tried to shake us down and wound up handing us everything. Maybe that's the real takeaway. Greed has a strange way of dragging long-buried truths into the light. If you've read this far, I'd honestly love to hear your thoughts. Ever had something spiral out of control, only to land exactly where it needed to? And if this story hit home and you want to support more like it, there's a little thanks button below. Appreciate you being here. Catch you next time.